All right, we were talking about this yesterday and the day before, and we're going to be talking about it a lot. And that is the president pushing his $1.8 trillion American Families Plan. A lot of it dealing with education, preschool education, early childhood education, and daycare. Now, just to put this in perspective, $1.8 trillion. In 2018, the total federal budget was just north of $4 trillion. This is almost half of the entire federal budget going to, like I said, education, early childhood, preschool education, child care, universal child care. I mean, all kinds of stuff that the left, it's a wish list for the left. But I want to zero in on this early childhood education or daycare, universal government daycare, and why we should be concerned about this. And to help me unpack this is George Barna. Many of you know him. He joins us now. He is world-renowned researcher. He's the director of the Research and Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He's also a senior research fellow here at FRC. George, welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you, Tony.
George, one of the reasons this should be on the radar screen of every Christian parent is the reality of when a worldview is formed in a child, and knowing that what we see coming out of the government today is not sympathetic to, but rather it is hostile toward a biblical worldview.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the research to figure out how does somebody's worldview develops, and we have to remember everybody has one, everybody develops one, starting somewhere around 15 to 18 months of age, and that worldview is almost completely formed by the age of 13. During our teens and 20s, we refine it, we figure out how to articulate it and implement it, but it's really those early childhood years that are critical. You'll remember that a lot of communist and socialist leaders around the world, totalitarians, have said, give me your children until the age of 7, I'll have them for the rest of their life. Well, they understand that. And of course, our government leaders understand that as well. And so it's imperative that we go back to the biblical perspective on this, which is that it's a parent's chief responsibility in life to make sure that their child's worldview is intentionally and strategically developed in concert with God's principles and commands. And so to turn that over to the public schools where they'll be indoctrinated with government perspective is the antithesis of what God has instructed us to do. That's handing them off to people who have a completely different way of life, and they will twist the minds of our young people. We've seen that done in many situations in our country already. And so this ought to be an absolutely alarming development in terms of public policy.
And of course, it's enticing to parents because this is going to save them a lot of money. This could be worth up to $12,000, $13,000 a year for parents. But let's look at the long game here. As you said, the indoctrination that takes place, and we've seen what's coming out of our public education system. So do we really want our kids there even earlier to be indoctrinated with this? How can parents, how can they work to counter what is happening in the public education system as it pertains to the worldview of their children?
Well, there are probably a number of courses of action that people can take. One of the things that's encouraging to me is thanks to COVID, more parents are becoming aware of what their children are actually being taught, how they're being taught, who's teaching them, what kind of documents they're being forced to read. And so what we've seen is that the proportion of children being homeschooled has risen from 3% to 11% in the last 18 months. Now, maybe all parents can't do the homeschool route.
Right.
So that means that they still have that primary responsibility to know what's going on in their child's education. They might choose to move them to a different school. They might choose to vote for a different board of education. They might choose to track much more carefully what's being done with their child's education and be very vocal about the things that they do not want their children to be exposed to, or to ask them to be removed from certain classes or certain teachers that are going to be providing antithetical education. And of course, it's imperative that we be telling our elected representatives at all levels, local, county, state, federal, certainly, what it is that we expect the public education system to do and not to do.
And they can also run for the local school board to affect change there at the school board as well. Folks, I encourage you to prayerfully consider that. But they can also do something that's more practical. Well, that's practical, running for the school board, but even easier to do is actually just read the scripture with your children and walk them through its application to the world in which we live.
Exactly right. Because, I mean, Deuteronomy 6 and many other passages talk about that being the primary responsibility of adults, raising children to be spiritual champions, young people who grow up to love the Lord and serve Him with all their heart, mind, strength, and soul. The other thing that they might take a look at is what's happening with their children in the church that they attend. Are they playing games? Are they simply being made to feel good and happy? Or are they actually learning what it means to be a Christian, developing relationships that will enable them to be more dynamic followers of Christ? That's a very important element as well.
Yeah, this you cannot be indifferent toward this and think it's just going to happen. You have to be intentional about developing within your child this biblical worldview. And I know so many parents, that later in life they lament where the decisions their children have made that they track left. But it all goes back to that worldview in the early years. The left seems to get that. That's why they want these children earlier and earlier so that they can indoctrinate them.
Well, of course, as you well know, there's, and the word may not be exactly accurate, but kind of collusion between government and big tech these days. And so what happens with our kids? Well, they spend a lot of hours in school. They come home, they spend a lot of hours with the media. And given that both of those sectors are providing the same messages, banging those same messages home hour after hour, day after day, week after week, we have to be intentional about counteracting the lies, the deceptions, the distortions, the errant worldviews that our kids are intentionally being taught by government and media. And the best place for that to happen is in the home.
Absolutely. George Barna, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for stopping by today.
Thank you, Tony.